Y Media Group, the fastest growing media group in North America.
Hello and welcome back to Y Media Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh, and the latest development on the CUSMA agreement. That is the Canada-U.S. and Mexico trade agreement that remains in force, but its future is now less certain after the Trump administration has declined to extend CUSMA for another 16 years. Now, Canada is seeking clarity on what happens next as the agreement enters into a period of an annual review, and that also means annual negotiations. There you have the Minister of Trade between the United States and Canada, Dominic LeBlanc, and also the top negotiator, Mrs. Charest, who are essentially now seeking what does it mean? Now it's not renewed. July 1st was the deadline, and now it goes into this annual review. So what does it mean next? We're already at the 6-month part halfway through this year. And so now this is very critical because this is North America's most important trade agreement that has now entered what would be a new and uncertain chapter. So this trade agreement is also, Canada essentially asked formally as well as Mexico to renew it for 16 years. And since it was not done so from the United States' behalf, then it goes into this rolling period. Now, the agreement itself remains fully in force until 2036, but the decision has created a lot of uncertainty for businesses planning long-term investments. Essentially, you have Canada's minister who's responsible for this trade agreement, Dominic LeBlanc, says that Ottawa is now looking for greater clarity from Washington, D.C. about how the annual review process will look like, how it'll work, what changes do the United States actually want from this agreement. And Canadian officials also say that they remain committed to preserving a trilateral agreement between the three countries, which really supports millions of jobs and billions of dollars in a cross-border trade. Now, this uncertainty will stem from this review period mechanism that is built into CUSMA when it replaced NAFTA back in 2020. So now what took place was in July 1st of 2020, CUSMA was announced, and then there was a criteria of a 6-year review. And the 6-year review came just and went on July 1st of this year. And so you have the situation where Canada and Mexico wanted to renew it until 2042, but it is not done so. So now it's in effect until 2036, unless you have a country give their statement that they want to finalize and annul the agreement, is essentially taking an exit, and that would be a 6-month notice that no country has done yet. So this is a time where President Trump said that, he argued essentially that the current deal, meaning CUSMA, does not adequately reduce U.S. trade deficits or encourage enough manufacturing inside the United States. This is why he decided not to renew it for the 16-year mark. Now, his administration has also signaled that it wants stricter automotive rules of origin, stronger protections against Chinese imports entering North America, and the changes affecting sectors such as dairy, industrial goods, and supply chains. When it comes to business leaders, well, they're warning that prolonged uncertainty could discourage investments in Canada. And when it comes to the automotive industry or industries like agriculture, manufacturing, and logistics sectors, they all are depending on what would be a predictable North American trade rules, predictable tariffs or tariff-free on their industries. Now, major companies, including General Motors, have emphasized that the integrated supply chains across Canada and the United States and Mexico are critical and essential to remaining competitive globally. So now this is where things are at, where you have about, $1.4 trillion that is at stake in this trilateral agreement between the three countries, which essentially covers all those different sectors that we talked about. Now, NAFTA, just a bit of background, NAFTA started in 1994 when it came to effect, and it stood for North America Free Trade Agreement. And then it was replaced under President Trump's first administration to CUSMA. in 2020 that replaced NAFTA. And then there was the mandatory 6-year review that just came and went. Now, this is critical because you also have General Motors that has made a big announcement since they saw also that the deadline came and left, because this uncertainty is, creates a lot of unpredictability in the future of the three countries in their cooperation, but also more specifically when it comes to the auto sector. So General Motors has now said that they want CUSMA renewed, and they're saying that it's essential to protect North Americans' integrated auto industry, saying that this region of how the three countries work together in the auto sector is why they have remained globally competitive, and any changes to it will affect the competitive nature of the auto industry. And also essentially saying that they want, all countries to come to the table and renew the agreement. So now they're urging the governments to preserve one of the most critical and most important trade agreements. And so, speaking at Calgary Stampede, that's taking place right now, Jack Uppel, who's the president and managing director of General Motors Canada, said that CUSMA remains very important and to keep North American auto industry competitive. He said that the agreement allows Canada, United States, and Mexico to manufacture, to operate highly integrated manufacturing region, and what he says is strengthening the industry against what would be a growing competition from in the auto sector, from companies in Asia as well as Europe. He also said that the stability is essential for the continued growth of the industry. And as we know that when it comes to vehicles, they cross the Canada-U.S. Mexico border multiple times before reaching consumers. So now you have the situation where you have like the engine, for example, being built in Canada and the transmission being assembled in the United States. And then you have the final vehicle potentially assembled and completed in Mexico. So when you have this situation where CUSMA is kind of hanging in the balance, it's very hard for a company like General Motors to be able to do business as it does in terms of its operations and manufacturing. So now any disruptions to that integrated supply chain could do a couple of things like increase costs, reduce investment certainty, as well as ultimately raise vehicle prices and also models being rolled out in time. So you have this broader industry that is agreeing on why CUSMA needs to be renewed and stated and kept in place, and not go through the hurdles of this annual review. So now you have 7 major North American automotive organizations that have jointly urged the United States, Trump's administration, to preserve the agreement, essentially arguing that CUSMA has supported billions of dollars in manufacturing, has also helped when it comes to investments, and maintained North America's competitive edge during a period of what we're seeing in terms of rapid technological changes with AI, with electric vehicles. And this is a time where GM is saying this is critical for it to sustain itself. Now, what's also compelling for Canada and Canadian workers is that it's very high stakes for Canada. So you have more than 90% of Canadian vehicle productions is exported to the United States. So, a few weeks ago when we had Minister Joly go to China and talk to BYD and talk about manufacturing their vehicles here in Canadian plants. Well, that's because the jobs that are here in Ontario or in Quebec, when it comes to the automotive industry, the vehicles they're working on, 90% of those go to the United States. So if there is an issue with working on American cars, then that's going to mean a lot of job losses here in Canada. So you have this situation where you also have 75% of Canadian exports that go to the United States. And now you have industries that are really speaking up and saying how critical it is for the markets to remain the way they are, and have this trade agreement renewed. So now what we're looking at is CUSMA does support hundreds of thousands of Canadian jobs. We're talking about billions of dollars in annual trade. We're talking about an integrated supply chain in North America, like for the example of what happens to even build an entire vehicle that goes back and forth between the three countries. and also the investment dollars that come in to the countries when it comes to these integrated industries between the three countries. And then there's also the likelihood of what does that mean for long-term competitiveness against European cars or Chinese cars. The Chinese EVs are now taking, 60% of market share. And any agreement that is weakened or delayed will essentially create production costs. It could delay investments, and it also could delay models that would reach the showroom. So this is the latest development when it comes to the auto sector and what is taking place now. One of the items that the Trump administration put forward was that they wanted to impose 82% requirement for when it comes to origins. So essentially, when it comes to CUSMA, it requires 75% of North American content for tariff-free vehicles under current rules. And the Trump administration is proposing an increase of from 75% to about 82%. So this is part of probably what's going to be in these negotiations that will take place annually. Now, Ontario is critical for the automotive industry. It remains Canada's automotive manufacturing hub. Major Canadian operations are General Motors, Ford, Stellantis, Toyota, Honda, and thousands of auto parts and suppliers are here in Ontario. So any disruption to CUSMA could directly impact employment, manufacturing investments, and what would be the future of EV production across Ontario. These are the things that we're watching in terms of what will be the real impact, and we're looking to see what Ottawa will do next. Now, but the main highlight is that CUSMA is still in effect. It will be in effect until 2036, and there'll be an annual review that will take place until then, until the three countries decide that they will renew it for that time period. And at the same time, you have the NATO chief that is demanding a credible defense spending plan ahead of what will be the summit in Turkey that's going to take place this week. Now, we're going to cover that in quite detail as the Prime Minister will shortly be on his way to attend NATO in Turkey. But here you have ahead of the summit, you have the NATO leader essentially gathering for this summit in Turkey. And this is one of the most consequential summits in years. And I'll tell you why. It's because you have Secretary General Mark Rutte that is telling the 32 member countries that they can no longer just come and promise more spending on defense, that they actually have to present a credible plan showing how they will meet the new NATO's ambitious new defense spending targets. So we know for the last decade, the defense spending was about 2% of GDP. Now all countries have met that requirement, and now that is being bumped up. And for that, you have the NATO chief saying that he wants to see a credible plan during NATO. So now the pressure is coming at a time where you have Europe that's facing this ongoing war with Ukraine and instability in the Middle East with Iran and the GCC countries, that has growing uncertainty around also the US military commitments. A lot of times, maybe a few times actually, President Trump has said he doesn't need to be spending more than other countries, that really, when it comes to NATO, the real pressure is on them being in Europe and not so much on America's side. You've had Vice President J.D. Vance give similar speeches, as well as Defense Secretary, Marco Rubio, who's Secretary of State, has also talked along the same lines when it comes to NATO. And they've also talked about moving some of their military presence from certain locations to others. So there's a lot of movement when it comes to NATO. And so this is a time where now you have NATO that's agreed last year to increase their defense and security related spending. And this was on the behest of President Trump, who said, you know what, 2% is still too low. And so now the new target is about 5% of GDP by 2035, replacing the old 2% benchmark. That essentially dominated discussions for quite a long time. If you recall, even though Canada is part of NATO, it was only spending about 1.3, 1.4% of GDP until recently it hit its 2% mark. And so did the other countries as well. So now, under the new framework, the countries are expected to spend, and here's the breakdown, is about 3.5% of GDP on core military capabilities, and that would include troops, equipment, ammunition, operations, and while there will be 1.5% that will be directed towards defense-related infrastructure, such as cybersecurity, innovation, and industrial capacity. So now the NATO allies must now submit an annual roadmap showing how they plan to reach those targets, not just say it or agree to it, but really show how they're going to meet those deadlines on an annual basis. Now, the pressure is coming at a very dramatic time as we've seen the security environment challenges with ongoing wars, and what we've seen because of ongoing wars, how that's impacted inflation, the global economy. It's impacted gas prices, energy prices. And so this is a time where you're seeing this massive escalation. Like, for example, Russia's war against Ukraine has continued now to its fourth year. And you have tensions that's remained high in the Middle East since last year. If you recall, there was a 12-day war with the United States, Israel, and Iran. And then this year there was over 3 months. At the height of it, it was about a 40-day escalation war period. And but now negotiations will still continue, and there's still rumors that a war may still erupt towards the end of the year. That's for another conversation to be had. But this is all, and all these wars have impacted global supply chains. It's impacted inflation numbers with energy prices increasing. It's impacted cost of living, grocery prices, everything else that's interrelated, right? So this is the same time where you have now also Washington, D.C. under President Trump saying, urging European allies as well as Canada to assume a greater responsibility than the U.S. Essentially, U.S. saying, you know what, we shouldn't be the one leading this, the rest of you guys should be, because you're directly impacted. And so this is huge when it comes to the United States review of its military posture overseas as well. So now this is a point where most countries, are now have reached that 2% of GDP. There's only, for example, Poland, they're actually now above that 3.5% of GDP in terms of spending. But then you also have to look at geographically where Poland is and why they'd have to do that. They're right next to Ukraine, and Ukraine has been in this war for about 4 years. And so you have the NATO chief that's saying that he's warning that, simply announcing a future intention is no longer sufficient, that this must be, a critical plan. And also for Canada, this would be a summit that will represent potentially another opportunity to demonstrate itself as what it's doing in terms of its recent increased spending in defense and what would be in terms of a long-term strategy. So far, Prime Minister Mark Carney, who's going to participate at the NATO summit, he has essentially put bids in. We're going to cover the latest bids on the defense spending and announcements that the Prime Minister is doing. But he's been very vocal about the defense industrial production, having manufacturing within Canada. This is also related to the Arctic security, as well as what we've seen take place in terms of more continued support for Ukraine, and that also means backed by Canadian dollars. Now, the summit's also expected to include announcements on new defense contracts, expanded weapons production, as well as what would be a closer cooperation among NATO members to address ammunition shortage, as well as strengthening military readiness. Now, it all appears that this is a massive posture with increased defense spending. It would probably project more wars in the future, because rarely do you spend high on defense and then just keep it in inventory. Although the posturing, sometimes could deter conflict, but it looks like things are amplifying. Now, this summit could, for that same reason, reshape what would be NATO in the next decade, right? Because when you have the focus that's shifted from whether countries should spend more or how quickly they can build their stronger militaries. Now it's about, yes, they've all agreed to it, and we want to see the roadmap to it. So what we're going to see after NATO is Canada's decision on defense budget, military procurement, Arctic security, and what would be probably more continued support for Ukraine and what it would mean for NATO's ability to deter future conflicts. So this is it's a very critical time as you have these increased threats that Canada has talked about. The Prime Minister has reflected on the threats with what's taking place with Russia, as well as cyber threats, a missile defense system that needs to take place, Arctic security because of Russia, as well as China's increased activity and what would be Canada's military readiness and defense manufacturing. That would be in-house, so the contracts don't just go overseas. Now, countries who have to provide proof, they actually have to now go into a process of implementation on an annual basis. So now when it comes to European allies and Canada, they've actually increased their defense spending by nearly 20% in 2025 compared to 2024. So you can see in just a year how much things have changed significantly. And hey, when President Trump came into office, he said, hey, what's 2%? Let's go to 5. And then Canada just went from 1.4% spending of GDP to 2%. And now we're talking about Canada's already talked about 4% of GDP by 2030. So that would double it in about 2.5 years. And NATO saying that European allies and Canada have collectively invested more than $571 billion in defense in the year of 2025. Poland's spending is about 4.3% of GDP on defense, among the highest in all of NATO's alliance. So we're keeping track of what this means. Of course, we're going to continue the coverage on NATO as it takes place and what it means for Canada and all the announcements that come out at this very critical time with these ongoing wars and what it would mean in terms of the political impact. Now, there's a lot of questions that remain. When you do about 5% of GDP on defense spending, that does mean higher government spending. That does mean budget pressures. But what would that be at the risk of? Would it be at the risk of other spending by the government, like healthcare, social assistance, social welfare? And what does it mean for what it could be in terms of a public debt? And some of these countries, it would increase it. And also the countries where there's political resistance to military spending, that should be increased, right? Because these countries are democratic countries that go into an election every 4 years, and it's the citizens of those countries that have to say, yeah, we want 5% of our GDP to go for defense spending in terms of ammunitions and everything else in between for defense spending. So this is a critical time to see, is this going to be at the risk of other critical things that Canada needs just to be able to meet its goals and targets by being part of NATO? And how will this reshape what would be the ongoing confrontation with Russia and Russia's response? And the other question that remains is that will the U.S. reshape its military role in Europe? Will they move some of their bases? Will they increase it or reduce it as they've been talking about? So there's a lot going on right now that we're going to cover in much more detail for you. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back.